Hercule Poirot and the Man Who Was in Every Portrait. Chapter 1. The Painting in the Gallery of Stars. In an elegant private gallery in Paris, a new mystery began to unfold among centuries-old oil paintings, marble sculptures, and whispers of old secrets. The Gallery of Stars, discreetly tucked away in the narrow streets of the Marais district, was an exclusive art haven for Europe's wealthiest collectors. It belonged to Madame Lucille Renard, the widow of a Viennese banker and a renowned patron of modern art. That evening, she was hosting a private event to unveil her latest acquisition, a series of restored 19th-century portraits, all from a former estate in Provence. The main room was lit by frosted glass chandeliers, their soft glow bathing the ivory walls. A string quartet livened up the atmosphere, while champagne flutes and sharp conversations floated through the air. In the midst of this refined setting, Madame Renard paused beside a medium-sized portrait depicting a woman with coiled brown hair dressed in an austere grey dress. Beside her stood a man with a barely blurred face, a thin moustache and a slanted gaze, his expression barely hinted at. "Curious, isn't it?" the hostess commented softly, addressing her close friend Baroness Devereux. "In each of the paintings we've restored, this same man appears, with slight differences, but clearly recognizable." The Baroness frowned, and none of the artists identified him? None. The strange thing is that they come from different eras, and different styles as well. It doesn't seem to make any sense, Madame Renard replied, taking a disturbed sip of champagne. Shortly after, a stifled scream shattered the harmony of the evening. A restorer named Émile Duret had been found dead in the second-floor storage room. His body slumped next to a box of portraits yet to be catalogued. Some guests were led out of the gallery as the police arrived. Madame Renard, agitated but calm, gave instructions that no one was to leave the building without being questioned. Meanwhile, Baroness Devereux's gaze, charged with cunning and a hint of conspiracy, shifted toward the portrait of the man with the thin moustache. "This," he whispered, "is a matter for an expert in human souls, and in ghosts that don't give up." The next day, in his apartment on the Rue des Capucines, Hercule Poirot received an unexpected visitor. Baroness Devereux, dressed in a black veil that did nothing to conceal her aristocratic air or her concern, presented the case to him. "Monsieur Poirot, a man has died, but the real enigma is not the corpse, but the face of a man who never ages, who appears in portraits separated by generations, a face that no one has painted," he said, placing a photograph of the portrait on the table. Poirot studied it calmly. His perfectly aligned fingers barely touched the edge of the picture. Clotilde's eyes shone with an almost childlike sparkle. "Ah, madame, you're not bringing me a simple crime. You're bringing me a contradiction. And where there's a contradiction, there's always truth, hidden like a diamond in the mud." The case had begun. Chapter 2. Meeting between shadows 2 days after the evening. At the Gallery of Stars, Hercule Poirot walked with measured stride along the Rue des Francs Bourgeois. He was wearing his usual pearl-grey suit, with a perfectly knotted silk tie, and carrying a cane, which he used not out of necessity, but out of elegance. At his side, Baroness Devereux spoke softly, guiding him toward the crime scene with the seriousness of someone who knows that evil likes to disguise itself as art. Upon arrival, they were greeted by Inspector Clément Morel, a robust man with a square moustache and limited patience, who regarded Poirot with a mixture of respect and scepticism. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, shaking his hand briefly, "I can't say I welcome your presence, but I don't reject it either. The case is peculiar." "Peculiar, you say?" replied Poirot mildly, looking towards the closed entrance of the gallery. "When art mingles with death, monsieur, always peculiar." They entered the lobby, still redolent of the incense used in the exhibition, though the place was now silent and the curtains drawn. The portrait room remained untouched, guarded by 2 officers who stepped aside as visitors passed. Émile Duret's body was found there, Morel said, pointing to a side door. "No one heard anything. The guests were downstairs. The autopsy revealed cardiac arrest, but the coroner can't explain the look of terror on his face, as if he'd seen a demon." Poirot nodded silently, crossing to the portraits. He examined each one carefully. 4 paintings, 4 different periods, 4 women, all in similar poses, and in each one, discreetly in the background, the same male face. Always present, slightly altered, but unmistakable. "Curious," Poirot murmured. "The man's pose varies, but his gaze is identical. Who restored these paintings?" "Émile Duret," Morel replied. "He'd worked with the gallery for years. He was very well known, detail-oriented, honest." "Too detailed, perhaps," Poirot muttered. At that moment Madame Lucille Renard walked in, tall, slender, with white hair tied back in an immaculate bun. She walked with the poise of someone who knows how to command without needing to raise her voice. "Monsieur Poirot," he said with a faint smile, though his eyes betrayed sleepless nights. "I'm sorry to meet you under these circumstances, but I appreciate you coming. What happened here is not normal." Poirot bowed his head politely. "Madam, crimes never are." They sat in a back room, away from the paintings. Poirot began to ask questions. How had she acquired the portraits? Had she known the previous owner? Who had chosen them? Madame Renard answered precisely. They were purchased at a private auction in Avignon. They came from an old estate called the Cypress House. The owner died without heirs. I sent my personal curator, Juliette Allard, to oversee the purchase. Poirot asked to speak to Juliette. She was brought in shortly after, a young, slim woman with round glasses and a tense expression. When asked about the painting's provenance, she was blunt. "I selected them for their artistic value. The portrait with the man intrigued me. At the time, I thought it was a mere coincidence." "And Duret?" asked Poirot. "He was the one who noticed the presence of the same face in several paintings. He mentioned it to me 2 days before he died. He was upset. He said someone had tampered with the old layers of paint, that something had been added later." Poirot narrowed his eyes. "Added, you say?" "Yes. He said the male face had more modern layers of pigment, as if it had been painted after carefully, but not in the 19th century. The Baroness crossed herself silently. Morel let out an incredulous exhalation. "A forger, then?" the inspector asked. "Perhaps," said Poirot, "but not the usual kind. This isn't fraud for profit. This is something else. An obsession, perhaps. or a message. He asked to examine Duret's restoration charts. While they were being brought to him, he walked back to the paintings. He stopped in front of one, bending down slightly. "My God," he whispered. "Here it is, right here, a different brushstroke, a shadow too precise. This man is not belongs to the painting. It was not part of the original. Are you saying that someone deliberately painted that man into the portraits to make him look like he'd always been there?" the Baroness asked. Poirot nodded, his eyes never leaving the man's expressionless face. "And I fear that Monsieur Duret, upon discovering it, signed his death warrant." The atmosphere became denser. Art had been altered. Death, sewn with a brush, and among the shadows of oil and varnish, a phantom face demanded attention. Poirot turned to the inspector seriously. "We need to talk to everyone who was at the party, because someone here didn't come for the portraits. But to make sure that Émile Duret will never speak." Chapter 3. Interviews under gaslight. The following morning, Poirot and Inspector Morel arranged a series of interviews in one of the gallery's side rooms. Once reserved for private presentations, this space had been improvised as a discreet interrogation room, with heavy curtains, a round walnut table, and a gas lamp, whose flame flickered with barely perceptible restlessness. Poirot, impeccable as ever, settled into a low chair with a small notebook in front of him, his fingers interlaced with a calmness that contrasted with the latent tension in the atmosphere. "Inspector," he said in a measured tone, "faces reveal more than words if one knows how to read them. Today we will be readers of souls." The first to enter was Juliette Allard, the curator. Although he had already spoken to them the day before, Poirot wanted to observe her in a different context, without Madame Renard's presence, without the chaos of the gallery as a backdrop. "Miss Allard," Poirot began gently, "tell me about Monsieur Duret. What was his character like? Did he have any enemies?" Juliette sat up straight, folding her hands in her lap. "He was reserved, meticulous, very dedicated to his work, perhaps too much so. He used to say that paintings spoke, that they had secrets. Some found him eccentric. I admired him. Although, I must admit, last week he was strange. He said someone was watching him, but he wouldn't say who. He even considered giving up the restaurant business." Poirot studied her without interrupting, then nodded and dismissed her with a slight nod. As soon as he closed the door, Morel snorted. Paranoia? Or did he know something real? Poirot didn't reply. His mind was already processing the contradictions. He asked the inspector to bring in the next guest from that fateful night, Jean-Marc Béroud, the art critic. Béroud, a man of about 50, was dressed with affectation, a purple scarf around his neck, an embroidered waistcoat, and a sardonic expression as a shield. "Et pour Duret," he said as he sat down, unprompted. A purist, obsessed with pigments and layers. He never understood that art is also illusion. "Did you know him well?" asked Poirot. "Enough. We argued once, months ago, when I criticised his performance at a Greuze. He took it as a personal insult. And did you notice anything strange the night of the crime?" "Just the usual in these circles. Veiled rivalries, feigned flattery. Although," he paused for a second, "I noticed Madame Renard arguing with him. briefly on the mezzanine, somewhat tense. Poirot raised an eyebrow. About what? I didn't hear it, but she had that look of hers, the I don't like being contradicted look. The detective gave a brief nod of thanks, and Beyroud left with a slight theatrical bow. One wonders, Morel said as he closed the door, whether a passion for art can lead to murder. Poirot tilted his head. It's not art that kills, monsieur, but pride. The next to be called was Mathieu Charvet, a private collector who had attended the evening. He was in his 60s, bald, with a slow gait, and eyes that avoided direct contact. His answers were evasive. He didn't know Duret beyond his first name. He didn't remember speaking to anyone else that evening, and he said he had left the gallery before the crime. Poirot observed this with special attention. But, monsieur, the check-out record shows that you left the gallery after that the body was found. Charvet visibly tensed. Well, maybe I was wrong. Times are confusing when champagne is involved. Poirot let the lie go without confronting him, but made a mental note. Lying about something as basic as departure time was indicative of nervousness, or guilt, the last to show. Up was Delphine Moreau, a young emerging artist invited as a courtesy by Madame Renard. Delphine, with her dark hair carelessly tied back, and wearing a coat that seemed too big for her figure, spoke in a low but determined voice. I didn't know the restaurateur. I barely spoke to him, but I saw something that seemed disturbing. Poirot encouraged her with a gesture. As I walked up to the second floor to look for the vanity, I passed the living room where the body was later found. I thought I heard a voice. A male voice, murmuring. I thought it was someone on the phone, but there was no signal there. No lamp on either. Could you recognize that voice? She shook her head. No, but she seemed calm. Too calm, if that makes sense. As if the speaker were in no hurry, nor afraid of being discovered. Poirot watched her for a long second, as if measuring every word, every gesture. Thank you, mademoiselle. You have been very helpful. When everyone had left, Poirot remained silent, his eyes closed, his index fingers together in an attitude of reflection. What do you think? Morel asked. I think, my dear, that the truth is hidden not in what was said, but in what it was said. All these guests share a secret, not necessarily the crime, but something, and the man in the portraits is the key. So, what's the next step? Poirot opened his eyes slowly. We'll return to the source, to the estate in Provence where it all began, the Cypress House. There, where these paintings were first painted, awaits the first shadow of this mystery. Chapter 4. The Farm Where Time Stopped. The train to Avignon slowly crossed the winter sunlit vineyards. Poirot, sitting in a private compartment with Inspector Morel, observed the landscape with abstract attention, as if the cypresses in the distance were silent accomplices of a truth yet to be named. La Maison du Cyprès, he said softly. A forgotten place, and yet someone wanted its portraits to speak again. Morel, lulled by the rocking of the train, straightened up. Do you think the killer is linked to the farm? Or rather, with its history? That estate, sir, is the only common ground between the paintings and the death of Émile Duret. There, we will find what Paris is hiding from us. Hours later, They arrived at the outskirts of the small village of Levigne. A carriage was waiting for them at the station. An old-fashioned vehicle, pulled by an ancient Citroën, driven by a man with a wide-brimmed hat who spoke little. The road to the farm wound through dormant fields. Finally, the car stopped in front of a rusty gate with a barely legible sign, "Private Property." Further away, on top of a lonely hill, stood the mansion, grey stone, sloping roof, shutters closed like eyelids over a face that no longer wants to look at the world. A man was waiting at the entrance. He introduced himself as Henri Gaillard, the estate's guardian. Thin as a reed, his face weathered by the years, he maintained a distant but not hostile demeanour. "I've been here since the last owner, Mr. Chasseron, died," he said, "taking care of what little remains. No one has lived here for 5 years. Poirot walked carefully through the hall. Dust covered every surface, but the walls bore marks where paintings had once hung. Here and there, paler shadows loomed on the wallpaper, like the ghosts of vanished art. "Were these the places where the portraits hung?" asked Poirot. "Yes, monsieur, the Chasseron collection. All portraits of family members or important associates. When the last Chasseron died, the estate was seized and the contents auctioned off. Most of the portraits were sold en masse to a dealer in Avignon." Poirot nodded, crossing the rooms like someone examining an invisible crime scene. He stopped in the library. There, on a table, he found an album covered by a faded linen blanket, opened it carefully. Sepia photographs, old portraits, and there it was, the face. "My God," he murmured, "he's him again. Here he is in a photograph of a family dinner. Not painted, not imagined, a real man." Morel approached. "Are you sure it's the same one? Look at the moustache, the tilt of his chin, the slightly tilted gaze. It's him. He's not an imaginary figure. This man existed." They spent the afternoon examining old documents, letters and diaries kept in a locked cabinet. Poirot found an intriguing reference in a diary dated 1872. Claude returned today, after his stay in Lyon. Marie still refuses to pose with him. She says she's afraid of what's in his eyes. But father insists, if we want to preserve the legacy, he must look like part of the family. "Claude?" Morel asked. "Could that be the man in the portraits?" "Possibly. An awkward relative, perhaps, illegitimate. Someone forced into portraits to fulfill a family image, and then erased from history. Unless someone took it upon themselves to bring them back, to make them visible again." An awkward silence filled the room. Poirot closed his diary and turned to Henri Gaillard. "Did you know anything about Claude?" The man hesitated. Then he nodded slowly. "My grandfather told me about him. An illegitimate son of the Chasseron patriarch. Never legally recognized, but raised on the estate. They called him the Invisible, because he never appeared in the records, but he was always present. They said the portraitists included him at his father's request, and then were asked to erase his face, or blur it out." Poirot frowned, and then he disappeared. Some say he died in a duel. Others say he was locked away in a sanatorium. No one knows for sure. So far," said Poirot in a low voice. The sun was beginning to set behind the hills. The golden light bathed the dusty windows in a melancholy glow. Poirot walked slowly to a side room, where he found an old easel with a canvas covered by a sheet. He picked it up. He held his breath. It was an unfinished portrait of a woman with a sad expression, and beside her, barely sketched, the face of Claude, as if the painter had stopped mid-stroke, unsure whether he should make the invisible visible. Poirot stared at that incomplete line for several minutes. "This man was silenced in life," he murmured, "and now someone is trying to restore him, not for justice, but for revenge." He covered the portrait again and headed for the exit. "Inspector, I think we've been following the wrong killer. Duret didn't die for what he discovered, but for what he interrupted. Someone is rewriting history with obsessive brushstrokes, and they're willing to kill to complete the painting." Chapter 5. The Portraitist of the Dead. Back in Paris, the city seemed darker to Poirot. The damp slate roofs reflected a perpetually grey sky, and the mist that drifted through the alleys of the Marais evoked the weight of the unresolved. That afternoon, Poirot stood in his apartment by the window, watching the raindrops fall with a melancholy rhythm. On the table behind him, carefully arranged, were the documents found at the estate, old letters, photographs, the 1872 diary, and a reproduction of Claude's unfinished portrait. Above all of this, a more recent sheet of paper, the restoration record for the painting, where Duret had noted the altered layers. "Claude Chasseron," Poirot said quietly, "silenced by his family, and now released back into the world with the force of a secret that demands to be revealed." A firm knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Upon opening it, he was met by the tall, dripping figure of Baroness Devereux, dressed in a midnight blue coat and a tilted hat with a drooping feather. "Monsieur Poirot," he said without ceremony, "I need to show you something." They sat in the living room while the housekeeper brought coffee. The Baroness took a small portfolio from her bag. She opened it with trembling hands, revealing a series of sketches and notes. These were found in Juliette Allard's room. A friend of mine works in Madame Renard's office. They were among her personal belongings, locked away. Poirot took the papers and examined them carefully. The sketches showed human faces, all similar, all in slightly different positions, all with the same thin moustache and the same tilted gaze. Claude, no doubt. The notes on the sides were even more disturbing. "It has to be in everyone. If you erase his face, I'll paint it again. He can't disappear again." Poirot looked up slowly. Did Juliette do this? Apparently, although no one has seen her since yesterday. Missing? The Baroness nodded. Poirot stood up immediately. The mental image was beginning to take shape, not of the crime, but of the psychological profile that mattered so much to him. A wounded soul, fascinated by an ancient story, with direct access to the portraits. A sensitive, solitary, cultivated woman, and perhaps obsessed. Half an hour later, Poirot and Inspector Morel burst into Juliette's small apartment, located on a quiet side street in the Latin Quarter. The door was opened by the landlady, an elderly woman speaking in a whisper. "I haven't seen her for 2 days. But I heard noises last night." Footsteps, a kind of sobbing. The interior of the apartment was dim. In the studio, among art books, pigments and paintbrushes, they found a cluttered table with canvases, photographs, and, in the centre, a half-finished portrait, It was Claude's face, but this time painted with a shocking level of realism. The eyes were vivid, the moustache precisely drawn. It wasn't a replica of the old paintings. It was a modern interpretation, as if the man, erased for centuries, had been returned to the world with a full face and presence. "It's here," murmured Poirot. Juliet wasn't looking to forge. She wanted Torres erect in her mind. Claude was a forsaken figure, a victim of oblivion, and she, his redeemer. Morel flipped through a nearby notebook. It was full of notes. Duret understood, but he wanted to hide it again. I didn't understand the justice of this. He deserved to be seen too. I wasn't going to let them erase it again. The inspector closed the notebook with a grim expression. So, the killing was an act of devotion. Of imbalance, Poirot corrected gravely. Miss Allard lost herself between history and symbol. She confused the restoration of a face with the redress of a personal injustice. She probably felt she was the only one capable of restoring Claude's dignity. Whatever the cost. They searched the rest of the apartment, but Juliet wasn't there. Nor was there any recent sign of her. The only clue was a train ticket found next to a half-packed suitcase. Destination: Lyon. Why Lyon? Morel wondered. Poirot frowned, remembering the diary entry from 1872. Claude returned today after his stay in Lyon. Maybe you want to walk where Claude walked, blend into his shadow. That evening, Poirot sat alone in his study, contemplating the most recent portrait. He wondered if art, when it is blind devotion, can become dangerous. If the attempt to give the dead a voice wasn't also a way of summoning ghosts that are impossible to control. He closed the notebook, turned off the lamp and muttered, "Justice doesn't consist in painting the faces of the fallen, but in understanding why they wanted to erase them." Chapter 6. The Restorer's Escape. Dawn cast a blue pallor over Paris as Hercule Poirot and Inspector Morel boarded the express train to Lyon. The normally vibrant Gare de Lyon seemed opaque, too, the detective's eyes, as if the city were holding its breath, awaiting an outcome. Juliet Allard's whereabouts remained unknown, but the banknote found in her apartment left no room for doubt. Her escape was directed, and that suggested purpose, not desperation. "Why Lyon?" Morel repeated for the third time as the train moved through misty fields. Poirot, sitting upright with his hands folded on his walking stick, answered without taking, his eyes off the window. Because in Juliet's memory, Claude Chasseron lived there, at least for a while. She doesn't just want to hide, she wants complete something. Return to the origin of the myth you've built in your mind. Like an artist returning to the first stroke of a painting he hasn't yet finished, they arrived in Lyon at noon. A cold breeze was blowing down from the Croix-Rousse hills. Poirot had sent a telegram in advance to the local police station, requesting surveillance of the modest hotels in the city centre. Juliet wasn't likely to be staying in a luxury hotel. The restaurateur who painted with feverish devotion was no worldly fugitive. She was hiding among silent shadows. Late in the afternoon, Commissioner Bernard, a robust man with a grey moustache, received them with news. A woman matching the description had been seen in the Santa Claire guest house, a discreet residence by the Saône River. She had checked in under the name Mademoiselle Leclerc, had no luggage, and asked not to be disturbed. "Should we go in right away?" Morel asked. Poirot shook his head. "No. If she feels cornered, she'll run away again. Let me speak first, alone." The inspector reluctantly agreed, and that same evening Poirot appeared at the reception of the boarding-house, wearing his perfectly ironed suit and carrying a small briefcase. "I wish to see Mademoiselle Leclerc. Tell her you're an old friend of Claude's." The receptionist, bewildered, went upstairs. A few minutes later, he returned and nodded timidly. "She will receive him, but only for a few minutes." Poirot climbed with measured steps. On the third floor, an open door let in a faint yellowish light. Inside, the room was austere. An open suitcase lay on the bed, a portable easel folded up against the wall, and on the floor a box of paints stained blue and ochre. Juliette Allard was sitting by the window. She was wearing a light coat and a linen scarf covering her hair. She looked more fragile than ever, but her gaze didn't waver when Poirot entered. "I didn't expect you to find me so quickly," he said in a calm voice. "Don't underestimate me, mademoiselle. Steps driven by obsessions follow very predictable paths." She smiled almost sadly. "Have you come to arrest me?" "I've come to understand her. Punishment, if it comes, is not my job. The soul, it's my specialty." Juliette looked down at her hands stained with dried pigment. "Claude, you already know everything about him, don't you? How they erased him, how they forced him to live as a ghost." "I know, but I don't know, because you decided to return it." She took a deep breath, as if the words were a weight she needed to finally let go of, because I too was invisible, in the gallery, in my work, in my life, always behind others. Duret appreciated me, yes, but he didn't see me. No one did, until I discovered Claude. And it was like finding myself. Someone who had been silenced for no reason. What he suffered was what I had lived in silence. Poirot nodded slowly, and then he decided to restore it. "Not just in the paintings," Juliette said, her voice trembling. "In the story, too. I started with subtle strokes, barely any shadows, but when Duret found out, he was furious. He wanted to erase it again, and I couldn't stand it." A thick silence fell between them. "Did you kill him, Juliette?" She didn't reply. Her eyes, fixed on the reflection of the river in the window, shone with unshed tears. "I didn't mean to," she whispered. "It was a struggle. He took the brush from me, yelled at me, and fell. He hit the corner of a table. I didn't plan it, but I didn't ask for help either." Poirot closed his eyes for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was deep and clear. "Art cannot correct what truth has justly buried. Claude was a tragic figure, no doubt, but you, mademoiselle, have tried to make him a martyr through crime." She nodded slowly. Her voice was already a whisper. "Claude deserved to be seen. Perhaps," Poirot conceded, "but not at this price." Moments later, Morel and the officers entered the room. Juliette offered no resistance. She walked with them without saying a word, as if she had already experienced her punishment long before being arrested. That evening, Poirot returned alone to the bridge over the Saône River. The water moved slowly, reflecting the dim lights of the city. He took a small piece of paper from his pocket, a sketch of Claude's face, traced by Juliet's firm hand. He looked at it one last time, and let it fly away with the night wind. Chapter 7. The Final Echo of the Portrait. 2 days after Juliet Allard's arrest, Paris was returning to its indifferent rhythm. But in the small circles of art and criticism, the repercussions of the scandal were just beginning. Newspapers published discreet headlines. Restorer accused of manslaughter in private gallery. Artistic obsession or mental illness. The Allard case. In most of the cafes on Boulevard Haussmann, conversation lasted as long as a latte. However, for Poirot, the matter was not yet closed. That afternoon, in his immaculately tidy apartment, the Belgian detective stood in front of a reproduction of the first portrait he had examined at the Galerie des Astres. It was a photographic print, but Claude's face was still there, discreet in the background, with that expression somewhere between resignation and vigilance. Poirot wasn't looking at the man's figure. He was observing what surrounded him, the shadows, the glances of the other figures, the unlikely angle of his posture. Something, even now, didn't quite add up. A light knock on the door interrupted his concentration. "It was Baroness Devereux. I brought this," he said, holding out a sealed envelope. "It was delivered to me this morning at the gallery. It was addressed to you." Poirot carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a letter written in careful handwriting. "Mr. Poirot, although I can no longer return what I have broken, I feel the need to leave a final truth. Claude wasn't a victim of oblivion. He was an executioner. During his stay in Lyon, in Chauchet, 1871, before returning to the estate, he committed unspeakable acts. Women disappeared, children never returned home. He was buried in secret, not out of family shame, but out of fear. I found the letters of one of his victims hidden in the false bottom of the library cabinet. Duret wanted to destroy them. He said there was no point in tarnishing history. But I couldn't remain silent. You can't restore what was already. Corrupt from the start, I didn't intentionally kill him, but I don't regret preventing him from silencing Claude. Again. Juliet. Poirot read the contents twice, silently. Then he folded it and put it in his leather folder. Claude wasn't a martyr after all, he murmured. The Baroness sat down, her face pale. So Juliet was wrong? Poirot gently shook his head. Juliet was blinded, but not entirely wrong. She saw Claude as a symbol of the forgotten. And in that she was right. What she didn't understand was that not everything forgotten deserves to be remembered. "And now?" the Baroness asked. "Shall we let the portrait return to the gallery?" Poirot stood up, walked to his desk and took out a file. "No, those portraits must be removed from public view. Not because they contain anything criminal, but because they have ceased to be art. They have become a manipulated narrative that could attract other obsessives. Claude was used, distorted, turned into an idea. It's time to let him sleep in peace, not behind a wall, but in silence." That evening, Poirot made his last visit to the Galerie des Astres. Madame Renard greeted him with a restrained expression, a mixture of gratitude and exhaustion. "Have you come to see the portraits for the last time?" "I've come to close the circle, madam." They went up to the main hall together. The paintings were still hanging, but covered with fabric. Only one was uncovered, the oldest, where Claude appeared barely hinted at in the background. Poirot stopped in front of it. "Did you ever notice the direction of his gaze, madam?" She watched him closely. "I always thought I was looking at the woman in the portrait." Poirot smiled softly. "That's what everyone assumed. But look closely. He's not looking at her. He's looking off to the right, to an invisible point off the canvas, always looking off frame, as if waiting for someone else." Whom? To anyone who could understand him. To anyone who knew he was condemned in life, not for innocence, but for secrets too dark to be painted. Madame Reynard didn't reply. Poirot turned and started to walk away. "And what will you do with your copy of the portrait, monsieur? My lecture d'or. Burn it. Not because I fear it, but because I don't want it to become a fetish. Justice has spoken. Art must once again be art. Not confession, not testimony, not an open wound." He bowed farewell and walked firmly down the steps. Outside, the cold air barely ruffled his moustache. As he walked toward his apartment, Poirot silently reflected on the ultimate irony of the case. Claude Chasseron, the man who had appeared in all the portraits, had ended up as a spectre who had to disappear. For the second time. Not with violence, not with forgetting, but with understanding. Because sometimes, Poirot thought, true justice is not found in what we reveal to the world, but in what we choose to leave in the shadows. Chapter 8. The Portrait That Didn't Want to Be Burned. Despite Poirot's decision to close the case with dignity and silence, fate, like art, rarely obeyed with discipline. 3 days after his final visit to the Gallery of Stars, an envelope arrived at her apartment on the Rue des Capucines. No return address, no postmark, just her name, written in nervous black ink. Poirot opened it cautiously. Inside, a single sheet of paper, handwritten. "You thought that burning the portrait would end everything, but fire doesn't consume the truth. Claude is in more places than you can imagine. See the catalogue of the 1924 Florence exhibition, pages 34, 35 and 47. He hasn't seen it all. The handwriting wasn't Juliet's. It was more irregular, less elegant, almost shaky. Poirot didn't need to check the date to feel a pang of unease. The letter had been deposited recently. What he thought was over wasn't. He consulted his personal archive and located an old copy of the catalogue of the International Portrait exhibition held in Florence. He had participated in a secondary investigation years earlier, when one of the paintings was stolen during dismantling. The catalogue lay forgotten among his documents. When he searched for the indicated pages, the chill was immediate. On page 34, a portrait of an Italian countess painted by a disciple of Boldini. In the far left corner, between columns and tapestries, a familiar face. Claude. Page 35. A family scene, supposedly by an anonymous Venetian artist. Again, in the background, among the guests, the same face, different brushstrokes, different era, but identical in essence. And on page 47, a costumbrista painting of a café in Rome, where, almost invisible among the reflections of the window, Claude's face appeared like a ghost reflected in the glass. Poirot slowly closed the catalogue. His heart was beating faster than usual. "Could I?" he whispered. "Could there be more than obsession? More than restoration? He left his apartment immediately and headed to the National Art Archives, where he had acquaintances in the conservation department. He requested high-resolution copies of the aforementioned paintings and any information about their recent restoration. What he discovered was even more disturbing. The 3 paintings had been through conservation workshops in different cities: Naples, Geneva, Amsterdam, but in each one the same name appeared on the chain of restorers, albeit with slight variations: J. Allard, Allardini, Julie A. Juliet. Not a recent appearance. A trajectory. A systematic integration campaign. Poirot left the building with beads of sweat on his forehead. He stood under the pale Parisian sky, staring blankly at the passing carriages and pedestrians. The restorer had not only returned Claude to the portraits of the Gallery of Stars, had been putting in European art for years. Because, out of devotion, out of madness, or out of command. That night, Poirot didn't eat dinner. He locked himself in his study, surrounded by lamps, catalogues, and photographs. He analysed each portrait. He measured the proportions, studied the lines. He looked for errors, repetitions, marks. Finally, near dawn, he found what he was looking for: a small signature hidden among shadowy lines. It wasn't a visible signature. It was a number, R437. It didn't look like an official restoration number. It was a personal code. Poirot began reviewing the other old portraits in which Claude appeared. One by one, in different versions, he found the same hidden code in different places on the canvas. R437, a file, a sequential numbering. The next morning, he went to the National Library. He requested access to the records of active and former restorers. More than 2 hours of searching gave him the first realization. In 1937, there was an unknown Italian restorer, registered under the pseudonym Rosetta Allardini, who worked in Florence and later in Basel. She died in 1939, but the works she intervened in showed patterns very similar to Juliet's, and in at least 3 of them Claude's face appeared. Poirot leaned back in his chair. His mind, accustomed to order, felt the logical structure of the world beginning to crack. Claude wasn't just a figure erased and restored. He was a motif, a presence that someone, or several, had been inserting themselves, generation after generation, into the history of European art. Out of revenge? Out of cult? Out of some inherited obsession? Juliet had spoken of justice, but now it seemed she had been just one piece in something much bigger. Maybe she wasn't even the first. Maybe she was just replicating what someone else had already begun, decades before. What if Claude wasn't a symbol, but a vehicle? Poirot, who had always trusted in reason and the human soul, felt for the first time a shadow of something that was neither crime nor logic, something that bordered on the ungraspable. He put away his papers. He closed the study, and he left a single lamp lit, casting its light on the only portrait he hadn't yet burned. The one who seemed to look at him and wait. Chapter 9. The Society of Forgotten Portraits. A week after the discovery of the R437 code, the fog of uncertainty not only failed to dissipate in Hercule Poirot's mind, but seemed to thicken. What had begun as a crime, driven by a disturbed art restorer, now stretched like an invisible spiderweb across decades, styles, cities, museums, and generations of forgotten art. But one question remained. Who was the first brush that decided to paint Claude? Poirot, at his desk lit by the bottle-green desk lamp, leafed through documents and files until one name caught his attention due to its strange repetition in various contexts. Marguerite Vézelay. She did not appear as a restorer, but as catalogue, archivist, assistant curator, manager of minor works collections, always in the background, always behind the scenes. Even more intriguing, in 1936, Vézelay published a short essay under a pseudonym in a limited circulation magazine entitled The Figures That Disappear. The title was already provocative. Poirot managed to obtain a copy of the essay thanks to his contacts at the Forensic Library in Lyon. The text was brief, almost cryptic, but one sentence struck him like a bell. Some souls are condemned not to death, but to oblivion. Our task is to preserve them within the eternal framework of art, even if history denies their existence. Poirot closed the notebook. Claude, the repeated face, was not an obsession individual, but part of a philosophy, an almost liturgical doctrine. There was a disturbing logic to what Juliette Allard had done. She wasn't a pioneer, but an acolyte. That evening, Poirot requested a private meeting with Madame Renard at her personal residence in Montmartre. He was received with her usual courtesy, although the art patron looked paler, her voice laced with a caution Poirot already knew well, that of someone who knew more than she was letting on. Madame Renard, have you ever heard of an artistic circle called the Society of Erased Portraits? A thick silence. The woman left her untouched teacup on the saucer. Her voice, when she spoke, was barely a whisper. I thought it was a myth, something I heard in Vienna in my younger years. A semi-clandestine group of artists, restorers, critics, and patrons who believed that certain faces should not disappear from history, no matter how much history had condemned them. Faces like Claude? She nodded, not surprised. They were referred to as the unregistered, people whose lives were cut short, erased, silenced. They were said to have a silent presence in art as a form of symbolic justice, of balance. They were painted in the background of everyday scenes, hidden among the lines of the crowd, in reflections of mirrors, an aesthetic rebellion against the amnesia of history. Poirot folded his hands. Were you part of that society? She looked at him calmly. No, but I was close to those who were. I met Marguerite Vézelay. She told me about Claude. She taught me to look at the backgrounds of paintings, and to wonder why certain faces were repeated when they shouldn't have been. I didn't believe it, of course. I thought it was a game, an artistic fiction. And now I know that Claude was more than a painting. He was a symbol, and symbols, Monsieur Poirot, are harder to destroy than bodies. Poirot stood up slowly. So we're not chasing a criminal, madam, but an idea. That same night, the detective returned to his apartment. Just after 11, he received an unexpected call. Inspector Morella package had been intercepted at the Gare d'Austerlitz train station, addressed to an anonymous buyer in Brussels. It contained a painting recently stolen from a minor gallery in Marseille. Claude's face, once again, was there, in shadow. But that's not All, Poirot, Morel added gravely. There was also a letter, signed by someone who calls himself the Keeper of the Trail. Poirot asked for the contents to be sent to him by coded telegraph. The letter read, "You can't stop us. Claude is just one of the faces. There are many. They're already in private. Collections, churches, museums. They're our offering, our correction, our prayer." The chill that ran through Poirot was not the result of the night wind. I had reached the heart of something older than Juliet, darker, more deliberate, not a single crime, but a web of beliefs hidden behind pigments and varnishes. And while the world looked at the canvases for their shape and colour, others looked for what should not be seen. Claude, Poirot murmured, looking at the portrait he had put away for the last time. You weren't the end. You were the beginning of the frame, the silhouette of something even larger. And he knew then that the case, far from being over, was just entering its true composition. Chapter 10. The Museum of Silence. The Parisian winter had taken over the streets with a blanket of grey, and a freezing air that bit even gloved hands. Poirot, however, walked purposefully through the morning mist, his cane rhythmically tapping the damp flagstones of Boulevard Saint-Germain. He had an appointment he couldn't miss, one that, according to Inspector Morel's information, would lead him to the heart of the mystery, the Saint Hubert Museum, an almost forgotten institution south of the city, with private funds and a collection never opened to the general public. The invitation had arrived discreetly, a sealed envelope handed to us by an unnamed young man. Inside, a single line. Claude wasn't the only one. Come see what art hides. Saturday noon, Saint Hubert Museum, code R437. Upon arrival, the building was unimpressive. It had a blackened stone facade, closed curtains on the windows, and an old gate that creaked when opened. The entrance was guarded by a thin man dressed in black, who didn't ask for identification. He simply nodded and opened the door to let him in. Inside, a thick silence reigned. The lighting was dim, indirect. The walls were covered with medium-sized portraits, almost all dark, many by unknown artists. There were no labels, no dates, just faces, faces that did not want to be looked at. A figure emerged from a side gallery, Monsieur Éloi Gardet, a name Poirot knew vaguely from his previous investigations. An art historian, he had disappeared from the public eye for over 20 years. Monsieur Poirot, he said in an almost absent voice, it's taken longer than expected. It's never too late for the truth, Monsieur Gardet, Poirot replied courteously, although I confess, I'm not sure what truth this place offers me. Gardet walked slowly to the centre of the room, pointing to one of the portraits. A young woman in 18th century dress sat beside a harpsichord. In the mirror on the far wall, the face of a familiar man was barely visible. Claude, this portrait was altered in 1922, in Brussels, Gardet explained. The original reflection showed the lady's husband. It was replaced by Claude, by an anonymous restorer who died before being able to explain his work. Poirot raised an eyebrow. And you keep it as part of a collection? A preservation of traces, Monsieur Poirot. This museum doesn't show art, as it was conceived, but as it was intervened. Here you'll find works that contain what we call silenced figures. Claude is the most famous, but not the only one. They walked through the rooms. Each painting seemed to contain an anomaly, a face in the crowd, an incongruous reflection, a barely visible figure in the background. Codes R437 were marked on the back of each frame. One showed an English tavern scene, with a man with a thin moustache in the shadows. Another showed a religious procession in which a young observer, without a halo or name, seemed to look directly at the viewer from the edge of the painting. All of these were altered? Not in the criminal sense, no, Gardet replied. They were returned, the corrected, according to those who believe in our cause. Poirot stopped dead in his tracks. Our? So you are part of this society? Gardet smiled, though there was no joy in his expression. I was initiated in 1962, like others before me. Vézelay, Aladini, Juliette, though not entirely. She acted on impulse, out of personal trauma. We act from memory. Whose memory? Of those who were erased. Claude was an illegitimate child, not a criminal, as some say, but banished for convenience. His image was removed from family portraits, his letters destroyed. It was as if he had never existed. We believed he should be remembered, not with biographies, not with monuments, but with presence, subtle, persistent, sown in art. Poirot looked at him with a mixture of compassion and skepticism. And how many are there? Like Claude? Gardet looked down. 39, according to our archives. Recovered faces. Faces placed in more than 200 paintings spread across Europe. Some in public museums. Most in private collections. And what is your ultimate goal? None, Monsieur Poirot. We are not a political organization. We do not seek legal justice. Only balance. A silence fell. Poirot scanned the faces of the invisible figures who now seemed to multiply. He felt a discomfort that was difficult to define, as if the world, as he knew it, was splitting between what was seen and what was not. Inlaid behind the visible. What if someone one day decides to insert a face for dark purposes? He finally asked. Who controls the morality of what you do? Gardet replied without hesitation. No one. Just as no one controlled the oblivion that preceded them. When he left, the museum, the winter sun, was just beginning to filter through the clouds. Poirot paused on the sidewalk, looking back for a moment. The facade was still there, discreet, silent, invisible to unseeking eyes. Claude hadn't been an isolated case. He'd been a crack. And looking inside, Poirot realized that not every mystery seeks resolution. Some simply demand to be seen, and then forgotten again. Chapter 11. The Threshold Painter. 2 days after his visit to the Musée Saint-Hubert, Poirot had not slept peacefully again. It wasn't guilt, the crime had already been solved, nor the unease of what was hidden in art. It was a new kind of anxiety, that of a logical order that could no longer be applied to the facts. What he had discovered was not a plot or a murder, but a crack in reality where art was used as ritual, and memory was inserted as resistance. That morning, as she was organizing her notes, a letter arrived unannounced. Not by mail, but delivered by a boy of about 11 who didn't speak or expect a tip. He just left her the white envelope with the word, "For those who see what is missing," written in a slanted letter. Inside, a single line. Rue des Cendres, top floor, dusk. He wants me to watch him paint, unsigned, undated. But Poirot needed no more. He had already learned to recognize the signs of the silent network that orbited Claude and his visual cult. The Ash Street EE was a narrow alley in the 5th arrondissement, near the ruins of the Roman Forum, where the cobblestones still smelled of centuries-old damp. Poirot arrived at building number 9 shortly before dusk. He climbed a creaking wooden staircase with no elevator to the top floor, where the door that awaited him was half open. He pushed gently. The room was plunged into semi-darkness, illuminated only by the light from a gas lamp by the window. The smell of turpentine, linseed oil, and dried pigment floated in the air like a liquid memory. In the centre, in front of an easel, a man with his back to him waited. He wore a long coat and a grey beret. He painted without music, without words. The brush glided with morbid precision, as if copying an image he didn't need to see with his eyes. The canvas, still incomplete, showed the figure of a group of people at a train station. In the background, next to the bench, a face in the making. The outline of a jaw, a thin moustache, a tilted gaze. "Claude, again, I knew you would come, monsieur." "Poirot," the man said without turning around. "And who are you?" asked Poirot calmly, closing the door behind him. "I don't have a name that matters, but they call me the Threshold." The Threshold, because I am the one who draws the line between the history that was and the one that is could have been. The brush did not stop. What does that mean? I'm not the first, nor will I be the last. There are many of us. Some paint, others restore. Some place figures among archives. I work with oils, nothing else. Poirot approached slowly, without touching anything. He looked at the half-formed face. It was not a direct portrait. It was insert, like the others. But there was something new, something vivo. "Is Claude still the face they use?" The man nodded. "Claude was the first one we saw, the clearest, the most pained. He was condemned to leave no trace. We turned him into a trace. But now he's a symbol. His face appears not because we chose it, but because that's it in the images. We just make it visible. Aren't you afraid of distorting history?" The man gave a short laugh. "Which story? That of the victors? That of the burned archives? That of the names left out of the books? Will it repair what power erased, not with speeches, with brushes?" Poirot remained silent. Then, in a firm voice, he said, "And if someone, one day, decides to paint a face that wasn't forgotten because of injustice, but because of guilt, because of having caused harm." The man placed his brush on the edge of a palette knife. This time he turned around. He had a gaunt face, deep-set eyes. He looked no older than 40, but his gaze was that of an old man. "Then, Monsieur Poirot, it will be your responsibility, and mine, not Claude's, not Juliet's, not those who were erased. Because the dangerous thing is not remembering. It's not distinguishing, because we remember." Poirot looked down. A second canvas, covered with a piece of cloth, lay against the wall. The man made an inviting gesture. Poirot gently withdrew it. A portrait of him, Hercule Poirot, sitting at his desk, surrounded by documents. but in the background, among the shadows cast by the lamp, one more figure. Unmistakable Claude. How? Whispered Poirot, taking half a step back. He's already in your story, monsieur. He's been there from the beginning, ever since you looked at that first portrait and felt something was missing. You can't erase what you've seen. None of us can. Poirot took a deep breath. He felt the air thicken, as if art had become a living atmosphere. What do you want from me? The painter responded. Without drama, nothing, just that Seppa. So that when they persecute us or accuse us, you remember that everything we do is so that oblivion doesn't completely win. Poirot turned around. He took one last look at the portrait with his own silhouette and Claude's shadow in the background. I won't come back here, he said softly. No need. You've already crossed the threshold. That evening, upon returning home, Poirot lit a single lamp, left his walking stick beside his chair, and put away his notebook without writing anything. For the first time in his life, he had encountered a mystery he couldn't solve. Only respect. Chapter 12. The Last Frame. 3 weeks passed without Hercule Poirot uttering the name of Claude Chasseron. Not to Inspector Morel, not to Baroness Devereux, not even in his solitary reflections. The case had taken a form that could not be resolved with logic or criminal justice. It had infiltrated the most uncertain corners of collective memory. A conspiracy not of crime, but of symbolic preservation, and therefore alien to the traditional categories of good and evil. But the silence would not last. One March morning, upon receiving his usual mail, Poirot found an unexpected invitation among the bills and circulars. Printed on thin cardboard, without a signature or letterhead, it read simply, "The closure is at its origin. Come to the Vault Castle, March 14th, midnight." Poirot frowned. He knew that name, the Vault Castle, an abandoned mansion in the hills of Provence, a few kilometres from the Cypress House, where the first portraits had been found. According to old records, Le Voûte had been owned by an eccentric patron in the 19th century, an art collector and benefactor of disgraced painters. It was said to house an underground gallery, never officially documented. Poirot did not hesitate. He travelled alone, without notifying the police. Carrying nothing but his coat, a walking stick with a flashlight hidden in the handle, and a small notebook he hadn't touched since the day he met Le Seuil. The night of March 14th was windy. The moon, half covered by pale clouds, cast an uncertain light on the castle's eroded facade. The iron gate was ajar. There were no guards, no lights on, only the whisper of the wind and the crunch of dry branches under their shoes. Poirot crossed the threshold and entered. The interior, though dusty, was not abandoned. Someone had brushed away fresh cobwebs. The footprints in the dust were fresh. He followed the main corridor until he reached a spiral staircase that descended underground. There, carved in stone above the arch, was a barely legible inscription. The coup we don't name, those we look at without seeing them. Those who are not named, those who look at each other without seeing. He turned on the flashlight on his cane and descended. What he found below wasn't a simple gallery. It was a sanctuary, Dozens of portraits hung on the walls carved into the rock, all different: Baroque, Expressionist, Academic, Surrealist. They all depicted different scenes: weddings, departures, reunions, births. But all, without exception, contained a marginal figure, barely visible, and yet clearly identifiable. Claude, both young Claude, old Claude, disguised Claude, transparent Claude. It was like watching the evolution of a single face through all the ages, as if time hadn't contained it, but dissolved and redistributed it in pigments across the continent. In the centre of the underground chamber, a single portrait was covered by a white cloth. A card at the foot of the easel read, "The Last Frame." Poirot approached. He hesitated for a moment. Then, with slow hands, he removed the cloth, and he saw himself, an exact portrait, masterfully painted. He sits in his favourite armchair, a cup of hot chocolate to his right, and a stack of books to his left. Every wrinkle, every crease in his moustache, every feather in his hat meticulously detailed. But the most chilling thing wasn't the fidelity of the image, it was the reflection. In the window pane, painted in the background of the painting, there was a dark figure, a barely outlined silhouette, faceless, but with Claude's posture. Only this time, it was Poirot who was painting it. Poirot took a step back. His heart, normally steady as a metronome, leaped. "Who painted this?" he said in a low voice. A voice emerged from the shadows, calmly. It was painted by someone who understood that every investigation is nothing more than an act of insertion of meaning in chaos, just like art, your guard. He emerged from the opposite corridor, dressed in a grey robe, his hands clasped behind his back. "This place," he continued, "is not an archive. It's destiny. This is where those who saw more than they should have ended up. You, Monsieur Poirot, have seen. You have understood. And now, like all of us, you are part of the frame." Poirot stood his ground. "I will not be part of a crusade that confuses justice with obsession." Gardet smiled sadly. "You have no choice. Your face is already in the painting. And like Claude, it will remain, even if you disappear." Poirot turned off his lantern. In the darkness, he felt the portraits watching him, not with judgment, but with patience, as if they knew that sooner or later all those who seek the truth end up finding more than they bargained for, and that even the brightest ones could be painted for her. Chapter 13. Faces in the Shadows. Night had completely closed in on the Château de la Voûte, and in its underground crypt, Hercule Poirot stood before his own portrait. The silence was as thick as the damp air that permeated the stone walls. Each hanging portrait seemed to throb faintly with its own invisible pulse, and each gaze, even if painted, carried a weight heavier than judgment. Gardet hadn't moved. "You don't understand, Monsieur Poirot," he said in a low voice, as if afraid of stirring more than echoes. "What's happening here isn't a crime. It's a legacy. Official history buries us. We give back what was taken away, even if it's in the margins, reflections, or dark corners." Poirot didn't reply immediately. He was still looking at the painting of himself. The detail of the brush in his hand, so carefully rendered, was no mistake. In this work, he wasn't just the subject. He was also the agent, the one who paints, the one who gives form. But this legacy you speak of, he said finally, turning to Gardet, isn't it another form of imposition? Another narrative that replaces the truth, even if it purports to amend it? Gardet tilted his head affably. There is no single truth, only the perspective. Aren't you the one who reconstructs the truth with deductions, witnesses, perceptions? Aren't you the one who, in each case, constructs a narrative to explain what happened? Poirot remained impassive. Yes, but I always start from facts. You start from shadows. Gardet walked slowly toward one of the portraits in the background. It was a small Flemish-style painting, a domestic scene, an elderly woman baking bread. In the far window, behind the frosted glass, a barely perceptible face. This painting was restored in 1899 by a restorer named Annette Chardon. She did it without payment. She left no signature. She said she had to restore the witness that no one saw. And you call it justice? I call it memory. Poirot moved to the centre of the room. His gaze scanned the faces, searching for patterns, repetitions. Not all of them were Claude. There were others, unfamiliar faces, some vaguely recognizable. Different ages, different eras. Some identical to figures in unsolved cases. And then it stopped. A 20th century portrait with muted colours. A group of soldiers at a train station. In the lower right corner, sitting on a suitcase, is a young man who looked. Poirot felt a shudder. Hastings's face, not the Hastings of today, but the Hastings of his youth. Uniformed, tousled hair, alert gaze. Is this real? She asked in a whisper. Gardet approached. Yes, it was added in 1954 by an artist who said he had seen that man die in the war, but whose name didn't appear in any archives. He insisted his memory had been erased. He said it could only be preserved in art. Poirot took a step back. But Hastings, he did not die in the war. He is still alive. He is married. He has 3 grandchildren. Gardet nodded slowly, as if he had expected that reaction. So the question isn't why he's here, but who decided he should be? Poirot felt, for the first time, vertigo. It wasn't just Claude anymore, not Juliet, not himself. This secret network, this invisible brush society, seemed to have its own rules, its own reasons. It was no longer a question of resistance against oblivion. It was a question of a right, of placing new pieces into a story lived by others, a form of aesthetic domination. Who decides who should be remembered and how? He asked more firmly. Gardet responded without blinking. He who dares to look beyond the edge of the canvas. Poirot turned. He had reached the edge of the crypt. A stone wall covered by a single black cloth, larger than the others. Something about its size and position suggested it was special or dangerous. Gardet did not try to stop him. Poirot slowly removed the cloth. The painting was different, dark, almost monochromatic. It showed a room she didn't recognize. At first, it seemed empty. But as she looked closer, one by one, she saw the portraits on its walls. Portraits she'd already seen in the museum, in the castle, in the gallery. It was a painting from the complete collection, a metaframe, and in the centre, on a chair, someone sits, with their back turned. Small, with an oval head, perfect posture. Poirot, his own portrait looking out at all the others, as if it had been observed from within art itself. Poirot took a step back. Gardet looked at him with respect. The last frame is not one that encloses, but one, the look back. You've crossed it, Monsieur Poirot. You're no longer an observer. You're part of the archive. Poirot lowered his gaze, and he understood that the case had no guilty parties, had curators. He remained silent. He left the basement without a word. On the surface, the moon was still there, white as an untouched canvas. But Poirot no longer looked at the moon in the same way. He knew now that, perhaps, in some painting hanging in a forgotten house, a meticulously mustachioed figure was watching him, painting silently. Chapter 14. The Archive of the Unnamed. Over the next few weeks, Hercule Poirot remained in a state of inner vigilance that even the most baffling of his criminal cases had never provoked. He had solved murders that defied logic, revealed false identities hidden behind decades of deception, even dismantled entire societies of blackmailers. But what he faced now was not a traditional crime, but a distortion of time, of gaze, of memory same. I couldn't stop thinking about that last painting, his figure with his back to us, contemplating all the other portraits, an endless loop. Who had painted it? From what point in time? Was it a warning? An admission that, having seen too much, he had been sucked in? Poirot then decided to do what he always did on the verge of irrationality. Back to the facts, he returned, to his office. He organized his research from the beginning, page by page. The death of Émile Duret, the series of restored portraits, Claude's face, the trip to the estate in Provence, Juliette's escape, the Saint-Hubert Museum, the encounter with Le Seuil, the Château de la Voûte. Everything pointed to a structured, patient network, camouflaged among invisible restorers, dealers, and curators. They didn't just insert forgotten faces. They inserted versions from the past, nuances, false images that, over time, replaced reality with a more convenient one. And then a new element emerged. Among his papers, Poirot found a letter he didn't remember having seen before. It had no date or signature, just a heading. File C. Name not given. Name not given. The unnamed. It was an inventory, a short list, R401, Claude Chasseron, inserted in 7 confirmed works, 3 destroyed, 1 stolen, R402, Marie Belle-Jacquet, 1883, missing from the civil registry, inserted in 3 religious paintings, R403, The Unknown Child, a series of children's faces inserted into street scenes and genre paintings, R417. Unnamed figure, ambiguous features, present in 12 works, uncatalogued. Spontaneous appearance, R437, full activation, do not insert any more. Observation point reached. Poirot felt a chill, the nameless figure. R417, he appeared in multiple paintings with no clear authorship, no prior history. Was it possible that not only were forgotten people inserted, but also constructs faces that never existed, but whose repeated appearance gave them a retroactive form of existence? And what did full activation mean? Observation point. He stood up and searched through his archives for reproductions of the paintings he'd been analysing. And there it was, in an oil painting set in a hospital, in an anonymous fresco found in the Alps, in a 15th century Flemish tapestry. Always the same indistinct figure, a blurred face, a repeated pose. The R417. What if Claude wasn't the beginning? What if Claude wasn't real? The thought was heretical. Claude had appeared in records, in letters, in old diaries. But Poirot now knew. The curators of absence, they could insert more than faces. They could insert evidence, make artward manufacture, reality backwards. A terrible possibility opened up. What if Claude was the first success of a larger experiment? That evening, Poirot received an unexpected visitor. Not a messenger, not a letter, but Baroness Devereux. He was dressed in black. His eyes blazed with determination. He carried a book under his arm. "I found this among my late husband's papers," she said without greeting. "He collected forgotten art. But this isn't a catalogue. It's a diary." From a man named Emmanuel Duval-Poirot opened the notebook with tense hands. The first pages were incoherent, notes on pigments, coordinates, biblical quotations. But one line, highlighted in red, stopped him in his tracks. Archive C doesn't record what existed, but what was desired. Every repeated face becomes prophecy. Every unseen reflection becomes testimony. The observer becomes a part. Poirot slowly closed the notebook. "Do you know what this is, Baroness?" "Not for sure, but I know my husband believed in something called the final convergence. He said that there would come a time when an observer would see everything, and in doing so would dissolve into the canvas." She looked at him gravely. "I was saying that observer would be you." Poirot did not reply. He sat down in his armchair. The fire crackled softly. The clock struck 11, and on the other side of the room in the sideboard mirror, a figure looked at him. No Claude, no Hastings. The nameless face, the one that appeared in every painting, but that no one remembered having seen. The silhouette was standing, motionless. Poirot stood up slowly. He took a step towards the mirror, and the figure took a step back as well. It wasn't a reflex. It was a reverse observation, as if art had stopped representing and started responding. Poirot turned off the lamp. The file was open. Chapter 15. Where? The portrait begins. Paris, dawn. The fog rose like a veil over the zinc roofs, and from his window Hercule Poirot watched the dawning of the day with the solemn silence of someone who has left logic behind but has not yet fully crossed over. The figure in the mirror had disappeared, without a sound, without a trace, as if it had been a mirage. And yet the reflection didn't return the image with the same clarity as always. Something had changed, as if the edges of his face were now lines, not flesh. Baroness Devereux was still asleep in the guest room. She had insisted on staying as a precaution, though neither she nor Poirot dared to name what kind of danger might lurk in a frame, a reflection, or a false memory. Poirot went down to the study. He spread out on the table the documents from Field C, Emmanuel Duval's diary, and the personal notebook where he had compiled all of his observations since Claude Chasseron had first appeared in Madame Renard's gallery. At that moment he realized he had been composing his own portrait, not one with brushes and oil paint, but with words, notes, deductions. A reverse painting, where he was the object through his own thoughts, and like every object in the hands of the curators of oblivion, was being framed. He returned to Duval's notebook. He looked at the last pages. One was marked with a drop of red wax. Portrait doesn't begin with painting. It begins with the gaze that wants to see something that isn't there. That's why Claude works. It doesn't matter if it existed. What matters is that we imagine it. That desire makes it eternal. It makes it real. Poirot closed his eyes. He wondered if his search for the truth had been at its core a form of invocation, of inviting the face in the margin to enter. After all, an unsolved mystery is a shadow, and a shadow, if observed long enough, becomes a presence. That's when she heard it, the light, almost timid knocking on her front door. Not one that belonged to the postman, or to an impatient visitor. It was the knocking of someone who didn't want to enter, but to announce that they were already was inside. Poirot got out. He opened. The threshold was empty. But on the floor, carefully propped against the frame, was a long bundle wrapped in black linen, held together by a braided rope. He carried it inside cautiously. It weighed as much as a framed canvas. On the rope, a label, the first portrait never shown, never signed. Now it's yours. With slow hands, Poirot untied the knot. He unfolded the fabric with almost ritual precision. Inside, the carved wooden frame contained an aged oil painting. The scene was a painter's studio, set in the 19th century. An easel in the background. A figure sits in shadow. Beside it, a mirror. But what stopped the eye wasn't the study. It was the figure. A man, seated, facing forward. Old-fashioned clothing. His body is blurry, as if poorly restored, but his eyes clear, recognizable, watching him. Claude, only something in the painting was wrong. Poirot narrowed his eyes. He came closer, and he understood. Claude's face, he was not the same as before, didn't have the thin moustache, nor the melancholic expression. He had more marked features, a sharper gaze. He was a mixture. A face that subtly resembled Poirot himself, and to Juliet, and perhaps Duval too. A fusion, as if everyone who had looked too long had been sucked in. The painting looked at him with a power that didn't come from the stroke or the varnish. It came from the concept, from the collective desire. "My God," whispered Poirot, "the portrait doesn't show Claude. It shows the observer." At that moment, the Baroness appeared on the threshold of the study, wrapped in a velvet robe. "What's that?" Poirot turned to her, but his lips were dry. He had difficulty speaking. "It's the root." The first frame. The Baroness approached. She looked at the portrait and frowned. Then she paled. "But that face, it's not Claude, is what everyone fears to find," Poirot said, his voice barely audible. "The face that looks back at you when you no longer know whether you're solving a mystery or constructing it yourself." The Baroness covered her mouth. She took a step back. "What is this, Poirot? A warning?" He did not respond immediately. He just closed the canvas. He covered it again with the black linen. No, it's the origin and the end, and he understood that from the moment he saw that first portrait in the gallery. It had already been painted, not with oil, not with hands, but with the need to remember what did not exist. Because every memory begins with a useful lie, and art only transforms it into truth. Chapter 16. The Name That Was Never Given. At 9 o'clock in the morning, Paris had fully awakened, unaware that in an apartment on the Rue des Capucines, Hercule Poirot was observing a truth that shouldn't exist. The canvas wrapped in black linen rested on a mantelpiece, like a body not yet buried, and although he had sworn never to look at it again, he knew that the face, that uncertain, unclassifiable, fused face, didn't need to be contemplated to exert its influence. Poirot, who all his life had trusted in the weight of facts, now feared the most ethereal substance in the world, the shared desire. Because that was, I understood now, the true driving force behind Archive C, not restoration, not worship, not historical correctness, but the unspeakable shared desire to give shape to oblivion. While Baroness Devereux sat resting with a cup of tea in her hands, still apparently perturbed by what had happened, Poirot leafed through Emmanuel Duval's notebook again. He had reread the same passages several times. But now, looking at one of the last pages, he noticed a small pencil line in the lower right-hand margin. It wasn't written in Duval's trademark black ink, but in a different, more angular hand. The name that was never given can only be spoken once. After that, it becomes a face. Poirot sat up slowly. He took out a blank sheet of paper. He went over in his mind every piece of information he had gathered. Claude Chasseron, Juliette Allard, Le Seuil, Marguerite Vézelay, Gardet, the curators, the archive, they all orbited around the same thing. A figure with no clear history, no birth, no burial, who appeared in old paintings as if he had existed, before of its insertion. And yet no one, not even in the most esoteric circles, had given it a name. Until now, Poirot closed his eyes. He imagined the face as it had appeared, shifting, familiar, inexact. He remembered how Juliette had said that Claude was what remains when you take away all the other names. And then he understood. Claude wasn't a name. It was a function. It was a empty appointed. As if all the faces that were never recognized had been poured into a single mask, ready to be inserted into history with the precision of an ancient pigment. And that emptiness had a secret designation, known to a few. Poirot searched through the papers at the Musée Saint-Hubert. Among Gardet's notes, he found what he wanted, a pencil sketch. It showed a blurred figure. Beside it, a notation NND0, name not given. The name that was not given. Poirot sank into his armchair. "It's not Claude," he murmured. "It never was. Claude was a vessel, but his true designator is NND0. The first, the mould." At that moment, Baroness Devereux entered with hesitant steps. "What have you discovered?" Poirot looked up. His gaze had the serene, dangerous gleam of someone who sees the edge of an idea and decides to cross it. I've discovered that we're not chasing a ghost from the past, but an idea that is built in the present. NND0 is not a person. It's the first space that history left unfilled." The Baroness sat down slowly. "And now what?" "Now," said Poirot, taking up his notebook, "let's assume that NND0 doesn't want to be solved, that its strength lies not in its identity, but in its anonymity, and that the only way to stop its spread is to give it a name. But didn't you just say that naming it turns it into a face?" "Precisely," said Poirot. "A face can be enclosed in a frame. A name can be written on a tomb." The Baroness fell silent. Poirot opened a new notebook. On the first page he wrote with a trembling hand, "I name him Elian Verneau, a random name, invented, chosen for its musicality, for its neutrality, for its ability to exist without prior history." Poirot closed the notebook, sealed it with wax, and placed it inside the wrapped portrait. Then he made the decision he had been dreading for days. "Baroness, we're leaving for Switzerland tonight." "To Switzerland?" "Al asylum of Saint-Maurice, where works that must never be returned to the public are kept, where portraits poisoned by mythologies are locked away forever, where mirrors have no memory." "And what will we take?" Poirot looked at the canvas, sadly. The face of Elian Verneau, and his symbolic death. That night, before going to sleep, Poirot wrote a last note to himself. "I have named the unnamed. I have fixed what was mutable. And so, I have made it finite." But as he closed the notebook, he didn't notice that on the last blank page, a face had begun to take shape, not by his hand, not by his pen, but by a shadow that already knew the shape of his silhouette. Chapter 17. Where the signature ends, the train to Switzerland departed at dawn. As the landscape slowly transformed from the grey suburbs of Paris to the snowy valleys that heralded the arrival of the Alps, Poirot remained silent, the carefully wrapped canvas at his feet. In front of him, Baroness Devereux read an unopened letter. They didn't speak. There was no need. They both knew they were approaching the end of something, perhaps not the mystery, but their ability to continue ignoring what they had seen. The destination was the Asylum of Saint-Maurice, an institution located on the side of a Swiss mountain, where since the end of the 19th century, objects were kept, whose existence could alter more than the truth. The perception of truth, unfinished works, unsigned manuscripts, paintings that had driven their owners crazy, and since 1928, a sealed wing run by an order of archivists known as the Buried. I would very occasionally receive pieces delivered with a single instruction: never exhibit, never restore, never look at more than once. When they arrived, the air was pure and sharp. The building rose like a monastery lost among the rocks. Upon ringing the iron bell, they were greeted by a man of indeterminate age, dressed in a grey tunic and black wool gloves. "Welcome, Monsieur Poirot. We've been expecting you." Poirot didn't ask how they knew. He just inclined his head. The Baroness gave him a quick glance, but he didn't return it. They were led through silent corridors, past iron doors, to a windowless vaulted chamber. There, by the dim light of a gas lamp, 3 members of the Buried, sitting around a marble table. "Do you have the object?" Poirot nodded. He unwrapped the canvas, revealing the portrait. For a moment the three men stared at him. Then they looked down, as if they couldn't bear what they were seeing. One of them slowly reached out his hand. "Do you have a name?" Poirot handed over the sealed notebook. "Is called Elian Verneau." The archivist took the notebook, broke the wax, read the name aloud, and transcribed it into an antique leather-bound book. Then he spoke again, in a ceremonial tone. "Now that he has been appointed, he can be contained." The portrait was placed in a sealed urn. Nothing further was said. No explanation was asked. On the return train, the silence persisted. Only when they were back on French soil did the Baroness break the silence. "Do you think that will be enough?" Poirot, looking at the reflection of his face in the window, did not reply immediately. Perhaps not, but art responds to the name, and I gave it that name, as long as no one pronounces it again. Elian Verneau will sleep. She hesitated. What if someone paints it again without knowing it? Then it will be another face, another void. File C cannot be destroyed, only redirected. That evening, back in his apartment, Poirot found an envelope slipped under his door. He opened it slowly. It contained no threat, no invitation, just one leaf. In it, a single sentence. "Every signature is a cage, but only if it's written in full." Poirot put the sheet of paper away. He slipped it into the fire without reading it again. He sat down at his desk, lit a lamp, and opened his personal notebook. With a black pen, he began to write his final report. Case: the man in all the portraits. Status: unfinished final name, Elian Verneau. Fixed, not certified. Risk of narrative contamination. High recommendation. Art should be observed, not interrogated. Memory, when questioned, can become creative. Truth, multiplied, becomes a symbol. Poirot signed his name in his usual handwriting, round and precise. But as he looked at the leaf, he noticed something. His signature didn't end where he'd left the stroke. There was a barely visible extension, as if the pen on its own had continued the line beyond his control. And at the end of that stroke, a curve. Not a letter, a ear, one of Claude, of Elian, or what came after the name. Poirot snapped the notebook shut. He stood up. He turned on all the lamps in the living room, and he decided for the first time in years to sleep with the curtains open and the mirror covered. Chapter 18. The Face That Learned to Remember. The month of April arrived with a deceptive warmth. The cherry trees were in bloom in the gardens of the Palais Royal, and Parisian life, as always, carried on, indifferent to the mysteries that didn't appear in the newspapers. But in Hercule Poirot's meticulously tidy apartment, something had changed. From the day he signed the final report, Poirot had not returned to work on any case. His days consisted of short walks, silent reading, and long pauses in front of his desk, where the notebook with the word Verneau it remained closed, guarded by a red ribbon. The canvas, meanwhile, had disappeared into the sealed wing of the St. Maurice Asylum, locked away along with all the faces that never existed. And yet Poirot did not sleep, because every time I closed my eyes, the face reappeared, not in the form of Claude, not in the form of Hastings, not in the form of Elian, but as a fluid figure made of all the forgotten faces, all the crossed-out names, all the memories never admitted. A face composed not of identity, but of the need for something lost to be preserved, even if it has to be invented. Baroness Devereux had departed. She bid farewell with a brief note. "My place is not in the archives, but among the living. Thank you for remembering that." Poirot understood her. He knew that what she had witnessed shouldn't remain in her mind. Not everyone was made to inhabit the margins of the canvas, but he does. And so when he received an urgent telegram from Avignon, he wasn't surprised. Urgent. New portrait has appeared at private auction. Face similar to the one in the Claude case, but younger, more defined. Signed Yves. G. Morel, Yves Elian Verneau. The name had not only been contained, it had been accepted, signed, converted into a visual identity. And with that, the symbol had mutated. It no longer needed reflections. Now it had a signature. History. Direct presence. And that act made him more dangerous than ever. Poirot travelled the next day. The auction was held in a restored convent on the outskirts of the city. The portrait, displayed in a secondary room, showed a young man wearing a dark cloak against a dull red background. His posture was erect, his hands folded in his lap. The style was neoclassical, but with contemporary touches. There was no doubt it was new, not a restoration. And the face, it was that of a young man who didn't exist. But who could have existed? Too generic to be recognizable, but with enough detail to be remembered. The exact shape of a symbol. Poirot asked to speak to the auctioneer. Where did this work come from? It was donated by an anonymous buyer. There's no previous record. The frame, however, is antique, 19th century. The canvas, recent, no more than 6 months old. And the author? Unknown, but the signature is clearly visible, BV. Poirot looked at the painting for a long time. I knew what I had to do. He bought the portrait, not to destroy it, not to return it to the asylum, but to display it, because, for the first time since this journey began, I understood the core of it all. It wasn't the figure in the margins that gave power to the mystery. It was the silence, the secrecy, the denial of its existence. And by taking Elian Verneau out of the archive, by turning him into a name, a face, an author, and a symbol, had made him mortal. Having a story, it could have an ending. Weeks later, at a small exhibition in the Montparnasse district entitled Faces That Never Were, Elian's portrait hung in the centre of the room. Poirot watched it from a wooden bench, his arms crossed while visitors passed by, commented and moved on. Some said he reminded them of a distant cousin. Others said he had the expression of someone they'd seen in a dream. One even asked if he was a self-portrait of some young dead painter, but no one really recognized him, and that was perfect. Poirot stood up, approached the painting and wrote a single line in the visitor's book. Not all faces need to be remembered. Some just ask to be seen and left behind. And then, for the first time since the day of the first portrait, he smiled. Because I understood that art was not true, but it could be closure. And the face, that face without history, without crime, without identity, finally had what it had never had, a complete framework.